This audio message is a rebuttal of Thunderfoot's effort to portray all religion as irrational. In my opinion, dogmatic assertions are inappropriate in both religion and science. Therefore, every lecture, discussion, or textbook on a topic of religion or science should be prefaced with a disclaimer that the material presented is merely a fallible opinion of men, except in cases where the audience is already known to be well aware of this fact. That being said, I want to submit a seemingly irrefutable proof that the human body has a soul. It follows directly from two assumptions already prevalent among scientists. First, all matter is inert. No scientist denies the universal law of inertia, as far as I know. Second, all men have free will. For example, I can freely choose to harm people or show them kindness, or I can freely choose to attend a church or abstain from attending. The law of inertia means that a particle at rest stays at rest, and a particle in motion stays in motion until an external impetus alters its present state of motion or rest. To put it differently, an ordinary particle cannot control its movements because it doesn't decide when to move or where to move. Free choice isn't what propels its movements. An ordinary particle is therefore passive with respect to motion. The only way that such a particle is going to move is if an external impetus pushes it into motion. Such a particle doesn't cause its own motion. That's why if a penny fell in my hand, I would not get angry at the penny. It has no control over its behavior. Its motions are simply the laws of physics at work. It should not be blamed or faulted for its behavior because ordinary particles of matter are wholly passive entities. Their motion is entirely deterministic in the sense that the laws of physics are fully determinative of their motions. Hence, a cluster of particles should never be faulted, blamed, or punished for their behavior. Even our brain matter and central nervous system consist of such inert particles. But note what this inescapably implies. If a human being is merely a cluster of such particles controlled by the law of inertia, then all his behavior is fully deterministic. He cannot be faulted or blamed for anything he does. He should not be blamed, punished, criticized, or rebuked for his body's mechanical actions and his brain's electrochemical thoughts. He should never be judged or pronounced irresponsible, negligent, or malicious. Again, the law of inertia means that an object doesn't move itself. Rather, it is moved by other objects acting as an external impulse. If an impetus moves my body, I am not to blame. But if I move my body by free choice, I am to blame. What this implies is that free will must be understood and defined as a self-propelling force that moves matter in much the same way that an ordinary impetus moves matter. This is a sort of telekinesis whereby a speeding bullet, if it had such power, could, by the mere power of free choice, halt its own motion midstream instead of plunging fatally into its human target. By the mere power of choice, such a bullet, if it had this power, could turn around and fly back into the weapon that launched it. However, I do agree with modern science that the speeding bullet, in fact all the matter discussed in the science textbooks, all the matter in our universe as we ordinarily think of matter, utterly lacks this telekinetic power. Bullets do not spontaneously sprout wings and fly, much less fly by the mere power of choice, devoid of wings and fuel. In a nutshell, to say that a bullet cannot self-propel by the power of choice is simply another way of stating that it lacks freedom. In other words, a free act, an act for which a moral agent can and should be held responsible, must be defined as behavior self-propelled telekinetically by free choice. So then, why do we judge men? Why do we feel they should be faulted or held accountable for their actions? In a nutshell, how do we get freedom into the picture if all matter is supposedly inert? There are only two possible solutions. The first, of course, is to abandon the law of inertia. In other words, you could maintain that all ordinary matter is self-propelling, that it actually has a telekinetic free will even though it seems to be under the law of inertia. And that would really be good news because based on that assumption, we could start attempting to invent cars and airplanes that run without fuel by virtue of this power of telekinetic self-propulsion. However, I don't think too many scientists would be inclined to abandon the assumption of universal inertia. The second solution is to postulate that within the human body is a non-inert substance called mind or soul. This soul self-propels by free choice. It works like this. The soul is a tangible substance, somewhat like ordinary matter. When it freely chooses to lunge in a particular direction, this choice self-propels it in that direction, thereby dragging the human body along with it. The upshot of all this is that if I stab you with a knife as an act of free will, you can rightly fault me or blame me for my behavior. I cannot hide behind the excuse that the laws of physics or physiology caused my arm to stab you. Rather, my soul's free choice telekinetically caused my arm to move, and therefore I am guilty. Now, of course, it probably isn't necessary to insist that this tangible mind or soul is spread throughout the entire human body as to drag the entire body along with it. That is to say, if you prefer, you could hold or argue with equal cogency that this soul only resides within the brain. within my brain, my soul's free choice to stab someone precipitates, self-propellingly, an electrochemical impulse, which then results in a signal sent from my brain to my hand, and then the laws of ordinary physiology take over from there. That is to say, the muscular energy from food combustion provides my hand with the impetus necessary to stab you with a knife. Here, too, I would still be guilty of assault or murder as charged, as a result of self-propelling my brain to send a signal to my hand. However, given that my soul is self-propelling, why can't I simply fly away from my body as an act of free will? And how did I get trapped inside this body to begin with? Well, the Bible affords an explanation. It teaches that God has literally imprisoned my soul within this body until death, or until a judgment day of His choosing. According to the Bible, He passes judgment on the soul rather than on the body. Now, Thunderfoot claims that the Bible is very silly, and yet the writers were smart enough to imply that the body doesn't merit judgment by virtue of the universal law of inertia. Evidently, the writers were wiser than Thunderfoot, because he is still operating under the delusion that the human body and brain should be blamed or faulted for any bad behavior. That doesn't make sense. Only the soul, logically, can be blamed or faulted for any bad behavior, because the brain and body are simply operating under the law of inertia, just like a penny that falls on my head, or just like a rock, and therefore they are not to be blamed for any bad behavior. Now, is my argument for the existence of a soul a philosophical argument or a scientific one? It's quite scientific, actually. I believe in a soul for the same reasons that I believe in atoms. I've never seen an atom. But the observed data inclines me to believe in atoms. In the same way, I observed one man stabbing another with a knife. It is a fully scientific question to ask. In fact, CSI will ask this question scientifically. What is the impetus moving the hand? Is this simply ordinary physical laws at work? Now, in cases where free will seems to be at work, I am scientifically led to postulate another kind of matter, self-propelling matter, as the source of impetus for the hand's stabbing motion. Now, ultimately, I can't fully prove that atoms exist. No more than I can fully prove that the soul exists. All I can do is draw conclusions based on the observed data, based on the empirical evidence presented to me. In sum, I find it very disturbing and disingenuous that physiology textbooks fail to mention self-propelling matter, what I call a soul, as a likely predominant impetus in all human motility. As a matter of fact, without the concept of self-propelling substance, cosmogony itself is unintelligible. Personally, just to get into my own beliefs for a moment, I believe in two big bangs, as it were. This is merely my opinion, and it requires some clarification. In my opinion, time is not objective. It's not real. There is no river of time flowing over our heads. What's real is matter and motion. Time is just a convenient count of the number of motions transpired so far. But time cannot extend infinitely back, because if an infinite number of motions had to transpire before my birth would still be pending. Therefore, we are led to conclude that only a finite number of motions have occurred to date, which implies a first motion. The first Big Bang is simply God's first current of thought, self-propelled, of course. He thus emerged out of an original physical chaos, and over eons of time, diligently employed observation and experiments as to acquire all knowledge and all skills. That's who God is. Now, presumably, some of the physical substance in the original physical chaos never became part of his being, but rather remained somewhat spatially separate from him and essentially dead, that is, negligibly conscious, and thus essentially inert. He formed the universe and our own souls from this leftover raw material that never became part of his own consciousness or being. Now, about 15 billion years ago, his own self-propelling power exploded this raw material as a second Big Bang. This is the start of our universe. Currently, his own hand grips every particle of our universe tightly enough to keep it essentially inert, essentially unconscious, that is to say, negligibly conscious, except for those particles constituting our souls. He doesn't grip them quite as tightly. He allows them to have some free motion and free thinking. Now, instead of immediately creating Adam and Eve at the very outset, he instead spent 15 billion years conducting biological and scientific experiments in our universe. For instance, he created various species, such as dinosaurs, for the sake of testing their survivability and adaptability in various environments. He ran 15 billion years of experiments merely for the sake of verifying, to his own satisfaction, that he had finally become fully perfect in knowledge and skills. He wanted to be absolutely sure that he had the complete know-how to provide an environment suitable for Adam and Eve. An important stage in his experiments was the testing of apes, because they have a genetic composition very similar to that of men. Finally, he created several humanoid species, and then last of all, he created Adam and Eve about 6,000 years ago. Now, scientists have effectively demonstrated that evolution can and does occur. Evolution is basically adaptation, and occurs precisely because God designed into the genetic material a propensity to adapt to environmental changes for the sake of survivability. The extent to which evolution can be demonstrated, therefore, merely confirms the intelligent designer's magnitude of ingenuity. The problem is that science textbooks currently demand the student to accept evolution to an extent greater than what has actually been proven to have occurred. This is intellectual dishonesty. It's far too dogmatic. I can and do accept evolution to the extent that it has been demonstrated. I readily acknowledge that evolution has produced new species from time to time. However, I am not convinced that all species necessarily came into existence through evolution. God probably created some species from scratch, others through natural evolution, and still others through a quasi-evolution enhanced by his own self-propelling hand.